me some snaps and show some love for Miss Jessica Gomez.
Thank you. All right, y'all, I have to say I'm absolutely thrilled to have the next couple of minutes of your life with me right now. And it's because I have the pure conviction that no matter when change happens in our world, it's in your hands. It's in the hands of the youth. We look at any movement in the history of America or our globe, and you know that it's always you that moves us towards that social justice. And so, before I kind of start talking about what I do as a clinical psychologist, specifically one that works with communities, I want to back up about this process. And when I was asked to come here and speak to you all, I thought, well, talk about my work, talk about mental health or social emotional health, and you'll see that I'll use those two words interchangeably. I said, easy enough, right? But then I started to think, well, I could talk to you all about depression. Everyone knows someone that's been affected by depression, right? And it's a global epidemic. But then I thought, well, what about suicide? None of us can turn on the TV nowadays without hearing about a loss, and that's just on the TV. I guarantee everyone in this room knows someone who has either had the thoughts, tried, or actually taken their life. And it's completely preventable. But then I think about all the children and families that come into my consultation room with issues related to bullying. And let me tell you something about bullying. It's getting more and more vicious at a younger age. As a matter of fact, in my experience treating veterans who are coming back from war that are suffering from extreme anxiety and depression, I'm not able to distinguish the severe symptoms that I'm seeing in my kiddos that are as young as elementary school that have suffered severe isolation and bullying. And so, as you can see, I could have talked about equity, social injustice, racism, violence. Any topic would have been fair game, but I kept thinking about, I have this opportunity with all of these innovative minds in the room, and you all are gonna come up with solutions that we haven't even thought about in the field of mental health. And so, I'm gonna talk about belonging today. Belonging. Because that one word is at the core of every single issue I could have came here to talk to you about today, whether it's depression, bullying, racism, social inequities. It's this process of where as human beings we other people and don't see that we are actually more similar than different. And so before I get into the nitty-gritty of details of my work, I thought it was good for me to introduce who I am. And so who I am is, I'm a first-generation Mexican-American woman, first in my family to go to college, and let alone go on to higher education to receive a doctorate. And so, thank you all. And I thought that if I'm gonna talk to you about social-emotional health, then I have to be in relationship with everyone in this room today. And so I want to talk to you about that 1,500-mile journey my parents decided to do to the city of Chicago, specifically the South Side. So they picked this not by coincidence or accident, you know. What I know about the town they grew up in, it was very connected. People spoke their language. They didn't have to explain why their house smelled a certain way. People understood them, and people looked out for them. So they picked the South Side of Chicago, and what I knew about the South Side of Chicago in the 60s, it was super diverse. People from all walks of life. In my neighborhood, I could walk on the block and meet families from all places, and there were people that looked like me, and there were people that looked like you. As a matter of fact, I still remember walking the 2 blocks to my school, you know, as a kid, and everyone hangs out by the fences, and what they were doing is watching out for us. I knew that people were looking out for us. I could come out my house at any moment in those 4 blocks that were my world and find someone to play hopscotch with or basketball, you name it. And so that became my world. And what happens when we know that we belong, when we have a sense of community? We start to thrive. Our brains and the science is showing us that we thrive, the connections, the abilities start to kind of come together, and that allows you to be successful in an academic setting. And so I did really well, you know? And after that, you know, my parents had to, again, pick up everything they owned and move me 20 miles southwest of the 4 blocks that were my home in the South Side of Chicago. Now, why did they have to do that? You know, why didn't I have a school that could grant me the opportunities in my backyard, I thought to myself. And so I thought, well, how different can it be? 20 miles. complete and utter culture shock. You know, I get to my school and kids are asking me, why do you speak with an accent? Or when they came over my house, why does your house smell funny? And even on that blocks, remember I told you everyone was always playing, people were looking out? The houses were really far apart. No one really came out. It wasn't until later when the African-American family that lived across the street told us, yeah, we went through that experience as well. Now, luckily, we hung on to each other in community. And it didn't get any better once I got to graduate school, I'll tell you this. You know, I still remember my first lecture, 10 of us sitting there, and everyone's introducing themselves, and I'm like, oh God, I don't sound like any of these people. They speak so eloquently, so beautifully. And then they started to share about they were second, third generation doctors. They had been down this path. I hadn't. And I'll never forget the first paper I wrote. Now, I had always excelled in school, you know, had a strong community, even if it got smaller once I moved. But that one statement on my paper, the first essay I got back, that said, you don't write like a native English speaker. Now, whatever the intentions were, I only heard one thing, and that's, you don't belong. And so I went down to my advisor's office and said, I need to drop out, I need to do it as quick as possible, because there's no way I'm going to be able to succeed here or afford this education. Now, thankfully, my advisor, being a Cuban-American woman, first generation, and had become a psychologist probably in the 50s or 60s, when the field was dominated by males, basically, knew something about success. She took me under her wing, and so did a couple other women in the department. And they took me to lunch, they taught me how to speak, and the most important thing is that they taught me that the things that made me different was what was gonna make me successful and able to connect with people who needed our services the most. So that's part of the journey. But now I want to talk a little bit about social-emotional health. I've shared with you how before I became a psychologist, I knew that there was something about community, about belonging, that helped me be successful. And now in my work at Momentous Institute, and some of you all might know about the work here, it's a flagship organization that has been working on building social-emotional health for nearly the past 100 years. And this is our stair-step model. And as you see, it says safe relationships, self-regulation, awareness of self, having healthy relationships. And eventually, if you get through all these steps, you can be a change maker, right? Someone who makes an impact in the community. But guess what, folks? None of that is possible without that bottom rung, safe relationships. And the science is clear. No matter what, you can have all these things. If you don't have that connection, and I think about this, right? From the moment we come into the world, we are literally tethered to someone. Our survival depends on that person taking care of us. Why would we think that it's any different later in life? And so countless years of seeing hundreds, probably thousands of clients, and I've treated just about everything from trauma to depression to bullying. It all boils down to one thing, folks. And that's when people don't feel that they connect, that they belong to someone, that someone's looking out for them. None of the things that I just listed can happen. And so actually, the science shows, and we're getting to do some really cool stuff now with science, is we can do brain scans. And when people suffer from severe isolation, bullying, right, for extended periods of time, it starts to change the way your brain is wired. And we've seen this a lot in the prison systems when people who are put in isolation, right, they have behavioral, emotional changes, it starts to change their brain. So I'm starting to share a little bit of why it's important that we are connected to other people. And I'm going to point out a little bit about the emotional consequences when people don't feel connected. Depression, suicide at its most extreme form, anxiety. The one that catches me the most is stress. Did you know that most of the science out there, when we study diabetes, cholesterol, cancer, that the thing that underlies it is stress. And when we experience stress for prolonged periods of time, it opens us up to a lot of different mental health issues. And like I said, health problems. As students, here's where it becomes really important. We can't learn if our brain isn't functioning at full capacity. And if we don't belong and we're not connected, at least one connection, it's impossible to be successful in school. It becomes really difficult. Now I'm talking at an individual level. Now I want to talk about community levels of what happens when we don't belong. And you all know a neighborhood here, and it happens in most large cities. You'll have one neighborhood where there's a lot of resources, great schools, great libraries, grocery stores. You go a couple blocks over, and there's nothing. And that reminds me of my experience of why did I have to leave my neighborhood? And so that othering, that not belonging, opens us up as a society to huge inequities. Poverty, the cycle of poverty and low income. Health and well-being, we've studied certain neighborhoods, and your zip code can determine your outcome in life. There's something about that, folks. And at its most extreme form, people start to have contact with the criminal justice system. You know, I'm sure you all know about mass shootings. It's becoming more and more common in our society. And what I'm going to warrant and kind of push to say is that it is a consequence of people that have been pushed to the fringe of society. So what I'm saying here is belonging is natural. It helps to support who we truly are. And as I've said, when we don't have it, there are severe consequences, not just at an individual level, but at a societal level. Some of the science that has come out, and this still blows my mind, is the fact that our brain cannot distinguish the difference from someone actually physically hurting you to the pain of someone isolating you and making you feel like you don't belong. If you can imagine that, and what the effects of that are when that happens for years. I like to reference a lot of the work by Father Gregory Boyle. He is a Jesuit priest working in Los Angeles. And he is working to help ex-gang members kind of integrate into society and be successful. Now, he's not the first to try this, let me tell you that. But he's successful. And these people typically don't go back to the lives. They're integrated into their community and they have successful lives. And so I had the pleasure of seeing him speak last year and asked, what's the difference? And he said, it's simple. There is no them and us. There is only us. And he said, and when a human being knows that they have value and that they belong, sky's the limit. And that's all he's doing. He's like, it goes back to remembering to love our brothers and sisters. Before I present you with the challenge we're going to talk about today, I want to bring up the work of Bryan Stevenson. He is a lawyer and a social activist, specifically in the criminal justice system, and helping us and pushing us to reform it and acknowledge our history in this country. And I want you to remember the word proximity as I introduce this challenge to you today. Because I think it's, not that it's easy, it's still a noble act to go and serve, do community service, right? To go serve at a soup kitchen where there's need. But that's not what I'm talking about here, folks. I'm talking about going towards what's uncomfortable in our society and being in relationship. Bryan Stevenson asserts that if we're gonna make changes in our society, it's only gonna happen when we're in relationship. That's the only way anyone belongs. And so as I introduce you to this challenge, remember the words of proximity and belonging and that they are critical and it's hardwired into our DNA. Without it, we don't thrive, we don't survive, and we don't excel. So I trust that should your minds come onto this challenge, you're gonna come up with innovative things that us in the mental health field haven't begun to even think about. So, I challenge you to examine the concept of belonging as it pertains to mental health in your community and create a program that not only supports the isolated, but also lays the groundwork for sustaining a culture of inclusiveness. Thank you all for entertaining my storytelling, and I can't wait to hear what you come up with. Oh, questions. So I know this time is dedicated to see if any of you all have specific questions about anything I talked about. Yes?
You work in Chicago, you work all over the next. Can you give us like a comparison or maybe a difference of the youth growing up in Southside Chicago and the youth in Dallas? Did you hear?
Well, you know, I'm not going to paint a pretty picture and say that they're just like any big city, Liz. You know, it has its issues, but when there's that sense of community, we can thrive, right? Chicago kind of faces a lot of different issues, like we've seen some in Dallas, right? But I know that when there are strong people supporting our youth, pouring into them like this, that the sky is the limit. Now, some of the differences I've seen in the work I see here, and I don't know if this is what you're asking. When I first got here 8 years ago, I came here to finish my doctorate and said, I'm going back. But I saw the significant need in the community here. And I couldn't believe that just 950 miles specifically south, that the trauma that I'm seeing in the neighborhoods in this sector are significantly more than what I'm seeing. And specifically because where we're geographically located, I think that we have people coming from all parts of the world that are escaping violence and trying to find a haven. And so how do we as a community welcome and kind of integrate people that are coming to seek a better life? Because like my parents, I know, no one leaves what's comfortable because they don't have to. It's critical when you make that decision. So I would say that the trauma I've seen in Dallas is raw in a way that I didn't encounter in Chicago in my 10 years of practicing there. So, anyone else have questions, comments, suggestions? Yeah. I almost heard you.
In dealing with mental health issues, maybe just in a broader sense, do you know any like ways that will help or how to help other people? Could you give us like some tips or pointers?
I think that's an awesome question, first and foremost, and it's having the courage to ask that type of question in this setting, first and foremost, but I think it's about talking about it. In our society, we don't talk about when we're sad, when we're depressed enough, and making it normal to have these conversations. And you know, I like to say that emotions are visitors, right? And when we pay attention to them and just see them pass by, you know, and talk to someone about them, they don't become as big. When we hold them with someone, it doesn't become as big as a burden, right? So I would say as soon as anyone faces any of those feelings of depression or anxiety, talk to someone you trust as soon as you can, because it's like a snowball effect, right? It can grow bigger and bigger, but it is preventable, completely treatable. So.
Like you said, with like anxiety, you talk to someone like when you start feeling it. Does that also count for people that have like a mental problem, like an actual mental problem?
That's a great question. And I think what you're saying is there is a range on mental health issues, right, that can be in the more extreme and the more kind of day-to-day. I think that it can help. The more we isolate as human beings, the more we run into significant issues. So yes, I think that when we recognize them, we can treat them. One of my professors said something that I'll never forget. He said, being a therapist is basically doing brain surgery with words and with love. So. What's that?
Can you be a psychologist with psychological issues?
Can we give?
Can you be a psychologist with psychological issues?
Absolutely. And so I think the way we use words in our society too, right, even saying I have a mental health issue, you know, I wanted to share a little bit of my story because I grew up having that sense of belonging, and when I lost it and it fell out from under, I started to encounter those feelings of sadness, of not belonging, of doubting myself that can open up to bigger problems, right? But I think that, yeah, absolutely, even if you've had those issues, I think that's what makes us better at what we do. Now, you don't have to walk the walk, but it certainly helps to have known what the walk feels like. So. No. No. It depends on the specific mental issue, I will say, but for the most part, I would say that, you know, a lot of therapists are wounded, right? But they have worked on those wounds and they've healed them and become stronger people, right? But there's a difference. You can be wounded, but you can't be impaired, if that makes sense. So I would say if the mental health issue impairs, then that's a different. But I think you can have struggled with depression or anxiety or other things, and those are some of the most effective therapists. Some of the most well-known ones have come out and said, I struggled with bipolar or something like that. So great question, though. Sure.
Are psychologists allowed to see psychologists?
Absolutely, I encourage it. It makes us better when we talk to someone about what we're seeing, because what we're sitting across from is human beings and we're in relationship. It's, you know, I train a lot of students and they're like, teach me the technique, teach me how to do it. I'm like, it's not technique, it's relationship. It's attachment, it's showing someone that they exist and that they belong. So, all right. If there's no other question,
Can isolation lead to a potential sociopath?
Can isolation lead to?
A potential sociopath?
Like I said, I think isolation at its severest form can lead to a lot of not just physical changes, behavioral, emotional, and even the brain starts to change. So I think what we found from a lot of the studies is the more isolated people are, the more significant the mental health issues or violent behavior can be. And I would argue that a lot of the violence we've seen in our communities, whether school shootings or community shootings, are at the source of people being pushed away or not belonging. So. We have one over here. Project.
Do you think people use mental health issues as an excuse for poor behavior?
I never believed that. I always chased the why of the behavior because all behavior is communicating an unmet need. And so if we lean back and get under it, there's always a message under the behavior. I think we had one question here.
How does physical, social, and emotional, what's the name?
Health?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
How does it compare to each
I
other?
think what you're asking is they're interchangeable terms. I use mental health and social emotional health, so they're interchangeable words. And we're trying to move away from, not that it's a bad thing, mental illness, right? But that all of us needs to build up social emotional health in order to thrive in our communities, in our lives. So I think it's just a whole health word if we use social emotional health. So.
Thank you. What if the person with mental issues isolate themselves? What we can do for them?
What can a person, sorry, it's hard to hear up here.
What if the person with mental issues isolate themselves?
Isolates themselves?
Yeah.
That's a great question, and I think that happens a lot.
Yes.
I think that if it's become something that has led to them not being able to function in their schools and their lives, I think that's where we want to kind of bring in a professional to speak to them, and sometimes that can be hard, right? But I think that sometimes if we normalize it and say it's okay, everyone goes through some of these issues, talking about it, the more we talk about it, the easier it becomes. There's something I know about burdens. They're not meant to be carried individually. When we hold them in connection, they become easier to hold. Thank you all.